What is a pause squat? What is a pause back squat? In this video you will learn what is a pause squat, how to do a pause squat, what are the benefits of a pause squat, how long you actually have to hold the pause in order to get the best results, and how to implement the pause squat into your strength training program. So a lot of things to do. Let's get started. What is a pause squat? What is a pause back squat? Is there any difference? Well, pause squat simply refers to you're descending into the bottom position, hold the bottom position, pausing the bottom position, and ascending back. So having said that, the pause squat is actually just the movement of descending, pausing, ascending. So you can actually do a pause back squat, a pause front squat, a pause overhead squat, whatever. I guess you get the gist. A pause squat simply refers to pausing. Important, while you're pausing, you want to maintain tension in the body, you don't want to relax, and ascending back up. Most of the times the pause squat is done as a full squat. I've outlined the different squat variations before: quarter squat, half squat, full squat, deep squat. So the pause squat normally is done with a full squat, but you can also do it with a half squat or quarter squat. Or also, if you want, you can do different variations of a pause squat where you don't pause in the bottom position. You descend into the bottom position, ascend halfway up, pause, and ascend into the final end position. But let's not overcomplicate things. A pause squat usually is a full squat. You descend into the full squat position. You hold and pause in the full squat position and ascend back up. The next logical question, obviously, how long should you hold the pause? You need to hold it for a minimum of 1 to 2 seconds, otherwise it's not a pause squat. Most common is that you hold it for 2 to 3 seconds, but you can also intensify the pause by holding it for a longer duration, 3 to 5 seconds, or even 5 to 8 seconds. If you're going above, let's say, 5 seconds, you need to do another variation of the pause squat, which is the breathing pause squat. So you descend into the bottom position, pausing, holding your breath, coming back up. The longer the duration, it will become very difficult if you hold your breath. So you need to breathe into the bottom position. Again, a variation of the pause squat, which requires some practice to do. Having said that, with the different pauses and times of a pause, obviously, the longer the pause, the lower the weight you have to choose. Usually, a pause squat is done somewhere at around 60% of your back squat 1RM to 85% of your back squat 1RM if you do a pause back squat. So if you're opting to hold it for 3 seconds or 5 seconds, or even longer than that, you probably need to target 60 to 70% of your 1RM. If you hold it for 2 to 3 seconds, you can target 80 to 85% of your 1RM. But bear in mind, you need to have some practice to do that. If you do it for the first time and you do 80 to 85% of your 1RM, you might be struggling. So what are the benefits of a pause squat? Why should you do pause squats? Well, the most common use of a pause squat is because it strengthens the weakest point. For most people, the weakest point in a squat is the bottom position. I say for some people because there are exceptions to the rule where people have the weakest point, the sticking point, halfway up, for example. But again, for most people, it's in the bottom position. That's why the pause squat is a very good tool to overcome that sticking point. Remember, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. So if the bottom position is your weakest link, the pause squat in the bottom position is a good squatting variation where you can address that weak link. Another benefit, increased time under tension. Increased time under tension is associated with a strong stimulus for hypertrophy. Remember, hypertrophy, stimulus for hypertrophy is the height of the mechanical load, so the external load, but also the time under tension. By including pause squat into your training program, you can increase time under tension, which has a stimulus for enhanced muscle growth. But not only is that increased time under tension important for muscular hypertrophy, you can also use it in rehab. There are certain scenarios in rehab where an increased time under tension is very favorable to speed up the recovery process. Please remember I said some, not for everything. For some cases, an increased time under tension is favorable to speed up the recovery process. And that depends on a proper diagnosis in the first place. But back to the topic of benefits of a pause squat, of a pause back squat. Another benefit is it removes the stretch shortening cycle. Remember the stretch shortening cycle, the muscle gets stretched and shortens. And during the stretch, the eccentric loading, the muscle can store elastic energy, which is released in the concentric movement. So how is that a good thing if you remove the stretch shortening cycle? Because in most sporting actions you need a stretch shortening cycle. Removing the stretch shortening cycle can specifically target the parallel elastic elements and the contractile elements of the muscle and not the serial elastic elements of the muscle. So what does that mean? Well, the serial elastic elements is, in very simple words, the tendons, and the parallel elastic elements and the contractile elements are the muscle. Again, I've outlined that in previous videos. In the eccentric movement, especially the faster the eccentric movement and the higher the load in the eccentric movement, you can make use of the tendons for the recoiling, which takes a little bit of load off the muscles. So doing pause squats, you can remove this use of the tendons. So making a complicated thing easier, again, the pause squat can work on your rate of force development and on the concentric strength, because essentially you're removing the energy storage during the eccentric phase and purely concentrate on the concentric phase. The pause squat can also help with improving technique and refining technique. Why is that? Well, in the bottom position, you get a good feeling for where your foot pressure is, how your upper body is aligned, all the things you can effectively train with a pause squat. And pause squats have an effect on core stability. Core stability, what a word, right? Well, essentially going into the bottom position and holding the bottom position, you have to do the so-called Valsalva maneuver, which is holding your breath in the intra-abdominal region. And that activates the intrinsic and the extrinsic or internal and external muscles of the trunk to a greater degree. So the act of breathing and bracing activates the trunk to a greater degree than usual squats. So how to do a pause squat, or better, where to start with a pause squat? My first advice is use the warm-ups. Do it in the warm-ups of your regular squats to get a feeling for how to do the pause squats and how the pause squats feel. In my opinion, the warm-up is a great place where we can actually introduce new things as well as working on technical issues with intention. If you want to include pause squats into your training, the warm-up is a good place to start to get a feeling for how to execute pause squats. You can also make it easier for yourself and you choose a box where you can squat to a box, make slight contact with a box, and then ascend back up. That would be, for example, the first phase in the progressions of a pause squat. We spoke about loading, so make sure you reduce the load to 60% of your 1RM if you start out with a pause squat to really get a good feeling for how to execute the pause squat. And then once you're more comfortable and advanced with the pause squats, the next question that stands out is, well, there are basically two ways to do that. There are probably more than two ways, but two ways how it's usually done. You can either replace the back squats by pause squats, or you can do the pause squats in a second session, which is the lighter session in that training week. Now you ask, lighter, it actually feels heavier than a usual squat. Well, lighter doesn't always mean the subjective feeling of heavy or light. Lighter simply refers to the volume load. So the volume load is the repetitions multiplied by the sets multiplied by the weight lifted. Since you're using less weight in the pause squat, the volume load will be lower than in the back squat, in the regular back squat under the circumstances that you're using the same rep and set scheme in both squatting variations, so back squat versus pause squat. How to implement it into your training program? Yeah, so the next question is how to structure and how to plan the training. And here you have different options. You can opt for a 3-week cycle or 4-week cycle or 6-week cycle. Important is that there is a structured plan over multiple weeks with progressions in the pause squat. So a 3-week cycle, for example, could be you start with 60% of your 1RM. In the first week, you progress to 65% of the 1RM in the second week and 70% of the 1RM in the third week. If you want to do a 6-week cycle, you could do, for example, the same as we did before, 60% 1RM, 65% 1RM, 70% 1RM as an unloading week. Start the next 3-week cycle of the 6-week cycle with 70% 1RM again, but not as an unloading, 75% 1RM and 80% 1RM. The sets and repetitions then depend a little bit on what your training goal is and also the length of the pause. So the longer the pause, the less repetitions you'll be able to do. To wrap it up, what is a pause squat? How to use a pause squat? What are the benefits of a pause squat and where to implement? How and where to implement the pause squat? The pause squat is just a variation of the squat where you descend into the bottom position, hold the bottom position for a period of time. This is the pause, and then you ascend back up. How long should the pause be? Most common 2 to 3 seconds, a minimum of 1 to 2 seconds, but you can work up to 3 to 5 seconds, 5 to 8 seconds if you wish. Benefits of the pause squat: strengthens the weakest point, increases time under tension, removes the stretch shortening cycle, works on concentric strengths and, for example, starting strength and rate of force development. It's a great tool for technical work to feel where the weakest point in the technique is or where there are some technical flaws. It works on your trunk, enhanced core stability. How to do a pause squat and where to start. Use the warm-up to introduce the pause squat into your training program. Start with lighter loads, around 60% of the 1RM. And finally, how to implement the pause squat. Think about your training goal, what you want to get out of it. Design a 3-week cycle, 4-week cycle, 6-week cycle, or even 8-week cycle if you want to. Start with a fairly light intensity and progress over weeks to a higher intensity. Make sure if you do more than 3 weeks, let's say, to include deload weeks into the training cycles. And the repetitions to choose depend very much on the length of the pause as well as your training goal, whether it's working on strength or hypertrophy. That depends also a little bit on the number of repetitions you do in the set of pause squat.